The small town of Millbrook, Nebraska, had a way of turning whispers into storms. In the heart of America's farmland, where golden wheat fields stretched endlessly under vast skies, gossip traveled faster than the wind that bent the stalks each autumn, and no one knew this better than Eleanor Hartley. Eleanor was 26 years old, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire, and green eyes that held more determination than most people in Millbrook had ever seen. She lived in a modest white house on the edge of town with her mother, Margaret, a woman whose bitterness had grown deeper with each passing year. The house stood isolated, separated from the main street by a gravel road that few bothered to travel anymore. Eleanor hadn't walked in 8 years. A riding accident when she was 18 had left her with a spinal injury that stole the use of her legs. The doctors in Omaha had been blunt. She would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. But it wasn't the wheelchair that isolated her. It was the town's reaction to it. In Millbrook, where Sunday church services were social events and the Harvest Festival was the highlight of the year, Eleanor had become invisible. The young men who had once called on her disappeared. The women who had been her friends found excuses to avoid her. Even the pastor, Reverend Thompson, seemed uncomfortable in her presence, as if disability were contagious. God's will, some whispered. A punishment, others murmured. Cursed, the cruelest ones said outright. Margaret fed these flames. You've brought shame to this family, she would tell Eleanor during their silent dinners. No man will ever want you now. You're a burden, nothing more. Eleanor had learned to build walls around her heart. She spent her days reading books ordered from catalogs, teaching herself bookkeeping, and managing the household finances, something her mother couldn't be bothered with. She had stopped dreaming of love, of marriage, of anything beyond the four walls of her prison. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button. We bring you powerful, emotional stories every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this story takes turns you won't see coming. Now let's get back to Eleanor's world, because everything was about to change. Thomas Wade was not from Millbrook. He had arrived 6 months earlier, a quiet man in his early 30s with work-worn hands and a face weathered by sun and hardship. He'd purchased the old Peterson farm on the outskirts of town, 200 acres that had fallen into disrepair after old man Peterson died without heirs. Thomas kept to himself mostly, appearing in town only for supplies. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that always seemed slightly too long, and brown eyes that observed more than they revealed. The town's women had made their interest known immediately, but Thomas had politely deflected every advance. He had come to Millbrook to work, he said, not to socialize. What no one knew was that Thomas had come to Millbrook to hide. He'd grown up in Chicago, the son of a successful banker, but Thomas had never fit into that world of suits and society dinners. After his father's death, he'd discovered the bank's books were cooked, the family fortune built on fraud. Rather than continue the lie, Thomas had cooperated with federal investigators, testified against his father's partners, and watched the Wade family name become synonymous with scandal. The money was gone, seized by the government. His mother had disowned him. The woman he'd planned to marry had left him for a lawyer from her father's firm. Thomas had taken what little remained and disappeared into the heartland, looking for honest work and anonymity. The Peterson farm had been perfect, isolated, affordable, and far from Chicago's shadows. Thomas first saw Eleanor on a Wednesday in late September. He'd gone to the county clerk's office to file paperwork on his property when he noticed her through a window. She sat in her wheelchair at a small desk in the corner, carefully recording entries in a ledger. Her focus was absolute, her pen moving with practiced precision. What struck Thomas wasn't the wheelchair. It was the loneliness that surrounded her like fog. He recognized it because he wore the same loneliness himself. "Who is that?" he asked the clerk, trying to sound casual. "Oh, that's Eleanor Hartley," the clerk said with a dismissive wave. "Margaret Hartley's daughter, does some bookkeeping for the county. Tragedy, really. Used to be such a lively girl before the accident. Now she's just, well, you know." Thomas didn't know, but he wanted to. Over the following weeks, he found reasons to return to the county office. He'd ask questions about permits, about water rights, about anything that might let him see Eleanor again. She never looked up, never seemed to notice him watching. One afternoon in early October, Thomas gathered his courage and approached her desk. "Excuse me, Miss Hartley." Eleanor looked up, startled. People didn't usually speak to her directly. "Yes? I'm Thomas Wade. I bought the Peterson farm." He felt foolish suddenly, tongue-tied like a schoolboy. "I was wondering if you might have time to look at my books. I'm not much for numbers, and I want to make sure I'm keeping proper records for the tax assessor." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching for mockery or pity in his face. She found neither. "I charge 50 cents an hour," she said carefully. "That's more than fair. Could you come by the farm Saturday afternoon? I'll have everything ready." "I don't have transportation," Eleanor said, her voice cooling. People often extended invitations they knew she couldn't accept. It let them feel charitable without actual commitment. "I'll pick you up at 1 o'clock, Thomas said immediately. "My truck has plenty of room." Eleanor's breath caught. No one had offered to accommodate her wheelchair in years. "All right," she said quietly. 1 o'clock Saturday. That Saturday, Thomas arrived exactly on time. Margaret answered the door, her face pinched with suspicion. "You're the new farmer?" "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Wade. I'm here for Miss Eleanor." "My daughter is not available for whatever you're thinking," Margaret said coldly. "Mother, I agreed to look at Mr. Wade's bookkeeping," Eleanor said, appearing behind her mother. She'd dressed carefully in a simple green dress that brought out her eyes, and she'd let her hair down instead of pinning it back. "It's a business arrangement." Margaret's mouth tightened, but she stepped aside. Thomas moved forward naturally to help with the wheelchair, and Eleanor appreciated that he asked, "How would you like me to help?" rather than just grabbing the handles. The drive to the farm was quiet at first. The Nebraska landscape rolled past, autumn colors painting the fields in gold and amber. Finally, Thomas said, "Beautiful country out here." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "I grew up riding through these fields. Before." "You miss it?" It wasn't a question. And Eleanor appreciated that too. Every day, the freedom of it, the speed, feeling the horse respond to your touch. She paused. "People think losing the ability to walk is the hardest part. It's not. It's losing who you were. The girl who rode and danced and ran. Everyone looks at me now and only sees what I can't do anymore." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I see someone who learned bookkeeping despite having no need to work, who keeps doing a job even though the town treats her like she's invisible, who agreed to help a stranger with his taxes on a Saturday afternoon. That doesn't sound like someone who stopped being who she was. That sounds like someone who became stronger." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had seen her, truly seen her, as more than her wheelchair. The Peterson farm was more impressive than Eleanor expected. Thomas had clearly been working hard. The barn had fresh paint, the fences were mended, and the fields showed careful management. The farmhouse itself was simple but well maintained, with a ramp leading to the front porch. "You built a ramp?" Eleanor said, surprised. Thomas looked embarrassed. "Well, you can't do bookkeeping if you can't get inside." But Eleanor noticed the ramp was beautifully constructed, solid and smooth, with railings on both sides. This wasn't something thrown together that morning. Thomas had planned for this. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. Thomas had set up a large table with his ledgers, receipts, and scattered papers. "Sorry for the mess," he said. "Farming doesn't leave much time for organization." Eleanor rolled to the table and immediately began sorting through the chaos. "Let's see what we have here." For the next 3 hours, they worked together. Thomas was impressed by Eleanor's quick mind and natural head for numbers. She reorganized his entire system, showed him how to track expenses more efficiently, and found several deductions he'd missed. "You're not just good at this," Thomas said finally. "You're exceptional. The county is wasting your talents, having you just copy ledgers." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you. Most people think bookkeeping is dull work for spinsters. Most people are fools," Thomas said bluntly. He stood and stretched. "Can I offer you some coffee? I'm afraid I don't have much in the way of refreshments, but I do make decent coffee." "That would be lovely." While Thomas prepared coffee in the kitchen, Eleanor looked around the room more carefully. It was a bachelor's space, functional rather than comfortable, but she noticed small details. A book of poetry on the side table, a framed photograph of a much younger Thomas with a stern-looking couple who must have been his parents, and on the windowsill, a small pot of herbs struggling to grow. "You're trying to keep rosemary?" she called out. Thomas appeared with 2 cups. "Trying being the key word. It keeps dying on me." "Wrong location. Rosemary needs more direct sunlight and less water than you're probably giving it." Eleanor surprised herself by adding, "I used to keep an herb garden. Before, my mother let it die after the accident." "Would you help me with a garden?" Thomas asked suddenly. "I want to grow more than just crops. Vegetables, herbs, maybe some flowers, but I don't know the first thing about it." Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest, a door she'd thought sealed forever. "I'd like that." Over the following weeks, Thomas found reasons to need Eleanor's help. His bookkeeping, yes, but also planning the garden, organizing his house, even helping him understand the complex politics of the Millbrook farming community. He picked her up every Saturday, and those Saturdays became the bright spots in Eleanor's grey existence. Margaret grew increasingly hostile. "He's going to humiliate you," she warned. "Men like him don't want women like you. He's toying with you, Eleanor. When he gets bored, he'll move on, and you'll be left even more pitiful than before." But Eleanor had started to hope again, and hope was a powerful thing. Thomas, for his part, found himself falling in love. Eleanor's sharp wit, her resilience, her kindness despite years of cruelty, everything about her drew him in, but he held back, uncertain. He was a man running from scandal, hiding in a small town where he'd lied about his past. Did he have the right to pursue Eleanor when he was built on deception? The moment of crisis came in mid-November. Millbrook's annual harvest festival was approaching, and Thomas mentioned he was planning to attend. "You should come with me," he said, then immediately regretted it when he saw Eleanor's face close off. "I don't go to public events," she said quietly. "Because of the wheelchair? Because of how people treat me when they see the wheelchair." Eleanor's voice was bitter. "The pity, the disgust, the mothers pulling their children away as if I'm contagious. I've had enough of that for one lifetime." Thomas set down his coffee cup and moved to kneel beside her wheelchair, something he'd never done before. From this angle, they were eye to eye, and Eleanor could see the intensity in his face. "Eleanor, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear me. I don't care about your wheelchair. I don't care that you can't walk. What I care about is that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. You're brilliant and kind and stronger than anyone I've known, and if people in this town can't see that, they're blind." Eleanor's heart was pounding. "Thomas, I'm not finished." He took her hands in his. "I want to court you properly. I want to take you to the festival. I want everyone in this God-forsaken town to see us together and know that you chose me, that I was lucky enough that you said yes, but only if that's what you want. I won't push you into anything that makes you uncomfortable." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" "Because when I'm with you, I remember who I wanted to be before the world taught me to hide. You make me brave, Eleanor, and I hope I can do the same for you." Eleanor leaned forward, and Thomas met her halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, perfect. "Yes," Eleanor whispered when they parted. "I'll go to the festival with you." The news that Thomas Wade was courting Eleanor Hartley spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The reactions were mixed and predictable. Some people were scandalized. A healthy man like Thomas tying himself to a crippled woman? Others were cruelly amused, already taking bets on how long it would take Thomas to realize his mistake. The Harvest Festival was held in the town square on a crisp Saturday evening in late November. Lanterns hung from every post, and tables groaned under the weight of donated food. A local band played fiddle music while couples danced on the wooden platform erected for the occasion. Thomas arrived at Eleanor's house in his truck, cleaned and polished for the occasion. He'd dressed in his best, a pressed shirt and jacket that made him look less like a farmer and more like the banker's son he'd once been. Eleanor wore a deep blue dress that Margaret had tried to hide, claiming it was inappropriate for someone in your condition. Margaret stood on the porch as Thomas helped Eleanor into the truck. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," she hissed. "Both of you." "Good," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Maybe it's time this town had something worth talking about. When they arrived at the festival, conversations stopped. Heads turned. Women whispered behind their hands while men exchanged knowing glances. Thomas felt Eleanor tense beside him, and he reached over to squeeze her hand. "Together," he murmured. "We do this together." They made their way through the crowd, and Thomas kept one hand on Eleanor's shoulder, not to guide her wheelchair, which she managed perfectly well herself, but as a statement of unity. This was his choice. He was proud to be here with her. Reverend Thompson approached them first, his discomfort obvious. "Mr. Wade, Eleanor, how nice to see you both." "Thank you, Reverend," Thomas said pleasantly. "Beautiful festival this year." "Yes, well," Thompson cleared his throat. "I hope you're not, that is, I hope you're both being prudent in your friendship." "Our relationship is no one's business but our own," Thomas said, his voice turning cold. "But since you bring it up, I intend to ask Eleanor to marry me, so you might want to prepare for a wedding." The Reverend's face went pale. Around them, the whispers exploded into gasps and excited chatter. Eleanor stared at Thomas in shock. "You intend to what?" Thomas knelt down again. He was making a habit of this, and this time he pulled a simple ring from his pocket. "I was planning to wait," he said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "I was going to do this privately, romantically, but I realized something. I want everyone to know. I want there to be no doubt in anyone's mind, yours included, about how I feel." "Thomas, you don't have to," Eleanor began, but he gently interrupted. "Eleanor Hartley, I love you. I love your intelligence, your courage, your kindness, despite a world that hasn't been kind to you. I love the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, and the way you reorganized my entire life in 3 hours flat. I love that you see past what I was and make me want to be better." He paused, his voice catching. "I know I'm not much. I'm a farmer with more debts than assets, trying to make a life out of land that might fail me. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day earning the privilege of being your husband." The square had gone completely silent. Eleanor looked at the man kneeling before her, at the crowd watching, at the life she'd thought impossible being offered to her like a gift. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, "Yes!" Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, while the crowd erupted into applause. Not everyone was clapping. Eleanor could see Margaret standing at the edge of the square, her face twisted with fury, and several other townspeople looked scandalized. But for the first time in 8 years, Eleanor didn't care what they thought. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur. Thomas insisted on a proper ceremony in the church, despite Reverend Thompson's obvious reluctance. Eleanor worried about the logistics. How would she navigate the aisle? But Thomas had a solution for everything. "We'll put down a runner that's smooth enough for your chair," he said, "and I'll walk beside you the whole way. It's not traditional, but since when have we cared about tradition?" Margaret made one last attempt to stop the wedding. 2 days before the ceremony, she confronted Eleanor in her bedroom. "You're being selfish," she spat. "That man deserves a real wife, someone who can give him children, who can work beside him, who can—" "Mother, stop," Eleanor said quietly but firmly. "I'm marrying Thomas. We love each other. That's all that matters." "Love?" Margaret's laugh was ugly. "Love fades, Eleanor. And when it does, he'll look at you in that chair and resent you for trapping him. You'll see." But Eleanor had stopped listening to her mother's poison. She'd spent too many years letting Margaret's bitterness shape her own reality. Not anymore. The wedding took place on a cold December morning. The church was full, partly with well-wishers, partly with curious spectators who wanted to witness what they still thought of as a tragedy or a scandal. Eleanor wore a cream-colored dress that she'd sewn herself, with lace at the collar and sleeves. Her hair was crowned with winter flowers, rosemary, for remembrance and new beginnings. As she rolled down the aisle, Thomas walking beside her with his hand on her shoulder, she kept her eyes fixed on his face. The love she saw there made her feel like she could do anything. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Reverend Thompson stumbled over the words a few times, clearly uncomfortable, but Thomas and Eleanor barely noticed. When it came time for the vows, Thomas knelt again. His knees would be bruised by now, Eleanor thought with a smile. So they were at eye level. "I, Thomas Wade, take you, Eleanor Hartley, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand beside you, to kneel before you when you need me to see you as you are and love every part of you, in strength and in weakness, in health and in sickness, through harvest and through drought. I am yours, always." Eleanor's voice was strong and clear. "I, Eleanor Hartley, take you, Thomas Wade, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to challenge you, to support you, to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and our hopes for the future. You saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. I am yours, always." They sealed their vows with a kiss, and this time, the entire church applauded. Even the skeptics seemed moved. The reception was held at Thomas's farm, their farm now. Thomas had worked for weeks to prepare, with help from a few of the neighboring farmers who had slowly warmed to him. The barn had been cleaned and decorated, long tables set up with food, and a space cleared for dancing. Eleanor watched the celebration from her chair, feeling joy bubble up inside her. She was married. She was loved. She had a future again. Thomas appeared beside her, offering his hand. "Dance with me." "Thomas, I can't." "Yes, you can. Trust me." He wheeled her to the center of the barn floor, and the band started playing a slow waltz. Thomas moved behind her chair, and with his hands on the handles, he began to move them in time to the music. He spun her gently, pushed forward, and pulled back, creating patterns on the floor. They weren't dancing in the traditional sense, but they were dancing nonetheless. Around them, other couples joined in, but Eleanor only had eyes for Thomas. In that moment, she realized that disability hadn't ended her life. It had just changed the shape of it. And with the right partner, with someone who saw possibilities instead of limitations, she could do anything. The evening wore on, and eventually the guests began to leave. The last to go were the Hendersons, an older couple who farmed the land adjacent to Thomas's property. Mrs. Henderson took Eleanor's hands in hers before leaving. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I was one of the women who stopped visiting after your accident. I told myself it was because I didn't know what to say, how to act. But the truth is, your disability scared me. It reminded me that safety is an illusion, that any of us could lose everything in a moment. I let my fear turn into avoidance, and I'm sorry. You deserve better from all of us. Eleanor squeezed her hands. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. After the last guest left, Thomas and Eleanor sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the winter cold. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by city lights. Mrs. Wade, Thomas said, testing out her new name. How does it sound? Perfect, Eleanor said, though I never thought I'd hear it. I need to tell you something, Thomas said suddenly. His voice had gone serious. Something I should have told you before now. Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. All right, Thomas took a deep breath. My name is Thomas Wade, but that's not the whole truth. My father was Cornelius Wade of Wade and Associates Bank in Chicago. 3 years ago, I discovered he'd been defrauding clients for decades. I turned him into the authorities. The bank collapsed. The money was seized, and the Wade name became infamous. I came to Nebraska to escape the scandal. I lied to everyone here about my past. He turned to face her fully, and Eleanor could see the fear in his eyes, fear that she would feel betrayed, that this truth would change everything. I'm not from a farming family, Thomas continued. I grew up in mansions and went to boarding schools. Everything I know about farming I learned in the last year, from books and trial and error, and I'm terrified that I'm going to fail, that I'll lose this farm, that I won't be able to provide for you the way you deserve. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Then she said, Are you finished confessing? Thomas nodded, bracing himself. Good. Now it's my turn. Eleanor's voice was calm. I knew. You. What? I knew who you were from the beginning. I do the bookkeeping for the county, remember? Including property records. When you bought the Peterson farm, I saw the bank transfer documentation. Wade and Associates was listed as your previous employer. I got curious and looked up newspaper articles from Chicago. I saw the scandal, the trial, everything. Thomas stared at her in shock. You knew. This whole time. I knew you were running from something. I knew you'd reinvented yourself, and I understood why you didn't tell me. Eleanor reached for his hand. Thomas, I, of all people, understand that sometimes we need to escape our past to find our future. You could have stayed in Chicago, lived off whatever remained of your family money, but you didn't. You chose honesty over comfort. You chose hard work over easy lies. That takes courage. You're not angry that I lied? You didn't lie. You just didn't share everything immediately. There's a difference. Eleanor smiled. Besides, I'm not exactly in a position to judge. I've spent years pretending I didn't care what people thought of me, when the truth is their rejection nearly destroyed me. We've both been hiding, Thomas. Maybe it's time we stopped. Thomas leaned forward and kissed her forehead. How did I get so lucky? We both got lucky, Eleanor corrected. We found each other when we'd both stopped looking. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Eleanor said, So, Chicago banker's son, how exactly do you plan to make this farm profitable? Thomas laughed. Well, brilliant wife of mine, I was hoping you might have some ideas. Between your head for numbers and my willingness to work myself to death, we might just succeed. We will succeed, Eleanor said with certainty. We have something most people don't. We have nothing to lose and everything to prove. That's a powerful combination. And she was right. Over the following months and years, Eleanor and Thomas transformed the struggling farm into one of the most successful operations in the county. Eleanor's business sense combined with Thomas's dedication created something neither could have achieved alone. Eleanor set up a bookkeeping business from their home, serving not just the county but other farms in the region. She discovered she had a talent for identifying inefficiencies and finding creative solutions to financial problems. Within 2 years, she had more clients than she could handle. Thomas proved to be a natural farmer once he stopped trying to do everything by the book. He experimented with crop rotation, introduced new techniques he'd read about, and wasn't afraid to fail and try again. The land responded to his care, but perhaps more important than their financial success was the way they changed Millbrook itself. Slowly, other people with disabilities started becoming more visible in town. A veteran who'd lost his leg in the war started attending church services. A young boy with cerebral palsy began going to the general store with his mother. Seeing Eleanor thrive had given others permission to exist. The town's attitude shifted, though not overnight and not completely. Some people, like Margaret, never changed. Eleanor's mother remained bitter until her death 5 years later, never reconciling with her daughter's happiness. But others learned from Mrs. Henderson's example and acknowledged their own prejudices. The most significant change came when Eleanor approached the town council with a proposal. She'd been married for 3 years at that point, and had saved enough money to make a difference. I want to donate funds to make the town center accessible, she told the council members. Ramps at the general store, the church, the town hall, wider doorways where needed, smoother sidewalks. It's not just for me. It's for anyone who might need it. Mothers with strollers, elderly people with canes. We talk about community, but we've built a town that excludes people. That needs to change. The proposal met resistance at first. Too expensive, some claimed. Unnecessary, others argued. But Eleanor had prepared detailed plans and cost estimates. She'd secured matching funds from other sources, and she'd rallied support from the growing number of farmers who relied on her bookkeeping services. The changes were implemented over the course of a year. Millbrook became one of the first small towns in Nebraska to prioritize accessibility. Other towns began to follow their example. Through all of this, Thomas remained Eleanor's steadfast partner. He built her a greenhouse so she could pursue her passion for gardening year-round. He modified farm equipment so she could help with the work when she wanted to. He never made her feel like her disability was something to overcome. It was simply part of who she was, like her red hair or her sharp wit. 5 years into their marriage, on a spring evening that smelled of fresh earth and possibility, Eleanor sat in her greenhouse transplanting seedlings. Thomas found her there, covered in soil and smiling. "I have news," he said, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "Good news or bad news?" "The best news. The Henderson farm came up for sale. We can buy it. We have the money saved. Combined with our land, we'd have one of the largest operations in the county." Eleanor considered this. "That's wonderful, but that's not what has you this excited." "What else?" Thomas grinned. He could never hide anything from her. "I had a letter from Chicago. From my mother." Eleanor set down her trowel, giving him her full attention. Thomas rarely spoke of his mother, and as far as she knew, they hadn't communicated since he'd left Chicago. "She's dying," Thomas said quietly. "Cancer. She has maybe 6 months, and she wants to see me. She says she wants to apologize before she goes. Do you want to see her?" "I don't know." Thomas sat beside Eleanor on the bench. "Part of me wants to stay angry. She disowned me, Eleanor. She chose the Wade name over her own son, and now she's choosing you over her pride," Eleanor pointed out. "That takes courage too, even if it came late. Would you come with me to Chicago?" Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. She hadn't left Nebraska since before the accident. The idea of traveling to a big city, of navigating unfamiliar places, was daunting. But she looked at Thomas's face and saw the fear there. Fear of facing his past. Fear of losing his mother before finding peace. "Of course I'll come." The trip to Chicago was an adventure. Eleanor had worried about the logistics, but Thomas had thought of everything. He'd researched accessible hotels, planned their route carefully, and made sure she had everything she needed. The train journey was long but comfortable, and Eleanor found herself enjoying the changing landscape outside the window. Chicago itself was overwhelming after years in quiet Nebraska. The noise, the crowds, the sheer size of everything. It was both exciting and exhausting. But Thomas's mother had sent a car to meet them at the station, and soon they were pulling up to a grand house in one of the city's wealthy neighborhoods. "This is where you grew up?" Eleanor asked, staring at the mansion. "This is where I lived," Thomas corrected. "Millbrook is where I grew up." They were greeted by a nurse who led them to a sunroom overlooking an immaculate garden. There, in a chair surrounded by pillows and blankets, sat Caroline Wade. She was impossibly thin, her skin paper white, but Eleanor could see the beauty she must have once possessed. Her eyes, the same brown as Thomas's, lit up when she saw her son. "Thomas," she whispered, "you came." Thomas moved forward slowly, and Eleanor hung back, giving them space. "Hello, Mother. And you must be Eleanor." Caroline's gaze shifted. "The famous wife I've heard so much about." "You've heard about me?" Eleanor was surprised. "I have my sources." A ghost of a smile crossed Caroline's face. "I know my son married a woman the town called cursed, a woman in a wheelchair whom everyone said would ruin his life. I also know that together, you've built something remarkable, that the farm is thriving, that you've changed an entire town's attitude toward disability, that my son is happy for the first time in his life." She paused, catching her breath. "I was wrong, Thomas, about so many things. I chose money and reputation over integrity. I chose society's approval over my own son, and I've spent 3 years regretting it, too proud to admit my mistake until cancer forced my hand." Thomas knelt beside his mother's chair. He was always kneeling, Eleanor thought with affection. "I'm sorry about Father." "Don't be. He made his choices, and he deserved the consequences. What he didn't deserve was a son brave enough to choose differently." Caroline reached for Thomas's hand. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you, proud of the man you became despite your upbringing, not because of it." Over the next hour, mother and son talked while Eleanor listened. They spoke of memories, of regrets, of forgiveness. Caroline shared stories of Thomas as a boy, his kindness even then, his questioning of the shallow world they inhabited, his dreams of a different life. Finally, Caroline turned to Eleanor. Will you tell me how you two met? I want to hear it in your words. Eleanor shared their story. The county office, the bookkeeping, the slow building of trust and love. She talked about the harvest festival and Thomas's public proposal. She described their wedding and the life they'd built together. When she finished, Caroline was crying. That's what love should be, she said softly. What I had with Cornelius was a business arrangement. We married for status and money, not for each other. But you two, you chose each other despite everything, maybe because of everything. That's rare and precious. Before they left Chicago 3 days later, Caroline called them to her room one final time. She handed Thomas a small wooden box. These were my mother's, she said. Jewelry mostly, not the flashy pieces. The good stuff was seized with everything else, but the personal pieces, the ones with meaning. I want you to have them, Eleanor. You're more family to my son than I ever was. You deserve them. Eleanor opened the box to find delicate pieces. A simple pearl necklace, a pair of emerald earrings, a bracelet with charms representing different moments in life. Thank you, Eleanor whispered. I'll treasure them. No, Caroline said. Thank you. Thank you for loving my son when I failed to. Thank you for showing him what family really means. Caroline Wade died 6 weeks later. Thomas received a letter informing him that she'd left him a small inheritance. Not the fortune that had been lost, but enough to be meaningful. She'd also left instructions that she be buried not in the Wade family plot, but in a simple cemetery in Nebraska, near the farm where her son had found his true home. She wanted to be near us, Thomas said, reading the letter with tears in his eyes. Even in death, she wanted to be part of our life. They buried Caroline on a hillside overlooking the farm on a warm June morning. Only a handful of people attended. Thomas and Eleanor, the Hendersons, Reverend Thompson, and a few other farmers who had become friends. It was small and simple, exactly what Caroline had requested. As they stood by the grave afterward, Eleanor took Thomas's hand. She found peace in the end. That's what matters. Because of you, Thomas said. You gave me the courage to forgive her, to see that people can change, even at the end. We all deserve second chances, Eleanor said softly. Your mother taught me that. Even Margaret. She paused, thinking of her own mother who had died bitter and alone. Even my mother deserved compassion, even if she never accepted it. Life continued its rhythm on the farm. With Caroline's inheritance and their savings, Thomas and Eleanor purchased the Henderson property when Mr. Henderson decided to retire. Their combined operation became known throughout the region for innovation and efficiency. Eleanor's bookkeeping business expanded, and she began teaching classes for other farm wives who wanted to learn to manage their family finances. But the real transformation came 7 years into their marriage, on an autumn evening that began like any other. Eleanor was in her office, a converted bedroom on the ground floor of their expanded farmhouse, when she heard raised voices from the road. Through the window, she saw a wagon stopped at their gate. A man was shouting, and a woman was crying. Thomas was already heading toward them, and Eleanor wheeled herself to the porch to watch. The man was Jacob Miller, a farmer from 3 counties over. His wife, Sarah, sat in the wagon bed, and Eleanor could see why she was crying. Her leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. We were on our way to the hospital in Omaha, Jacob was explaining frantically, but the wagon hit a rut and the wheel broke. Sarah can't sit a horse, and I can't leave her here while I ride for help. I saw your lights and hoped. Bring her inside, Thomas interrupted. We'll send someone for the doctor and get her settled until she can travel safely. Eleanor directed them to set Sarah up in the guest room downstairs. While Thomas rode to fetch Dr. Morrison from town, Eleanor sat with Sarah, who was white-faced with pain and fear. I'm so scared, Sarah whispered. The break is bad. What if I can't walk properly again? What if I'm crippled? Eleanor heard the word crippled and understood the terror behind it. In Sarah's world, in the world Eleanor had grown up in, being unable to walk meant being useless, pitied, discarded. Sarah, look at me, Eleanor said firmly. Look at me. Sarah focused on Eleanor, on the wheelchair, on the capable woman before her. 7 years ago, I thought my life was over, Eleanor said. I thought losing the use of my legs meant losing everything. Love, purpose, dignity, joy. I was wrong. Yes, my life changed. Yes, some things became harder, but other things became clearer. I learned who really mattered. I learned what I was capable of when I stopped letting fear and other people's limitations define me. She took Sarah's hand. I'm not going to lie to you. If you can't walk again, there will be challenges. People will pity you, or avoid you, or treat you like you're fragile. But you are not your legs, Sarah. You are your mind, your heart, your spirit. Those don't break. Sarah was crying harder now, but differently. I don't know if I'm as strong as you. You don't have to be as strong as me. You just have to be as strong as you need to be today. And then tomorrow, you do it again, one day at a time. Dr. Morrison arrived and set Sarah's leg. The break was bad, but clean. With proper care and time, she would likely walk again, though she might have a permanent limp. Sarah and Jacob stayed at the farm for 3 days while she stabilized. During that time, Eleanor showed Sarah what her life could look like. She demonstrated how she managed the household, how she worked, how she navigated spaces. She showed her the modifications Thomas had made and explained how to advocate for what she needed. The world isn't built for us, Eleanor said, but that doesn't mean we can't exist in it. It just means we have to be more creative. When the Millers finally left, Sarah embraced Eleanor tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave me hope when I had none." After they left, Thomas found Eleanor on the porch, watching the wagon disappear down the road. "You did a good thing," he said. "I just told her the truth. She did the hard part. She chose to believe it." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking. There are probably other people like Sarah. People who've had accidents or illnesses that change their mobility. People who feel isolated and hopeless because they don't know anyone else like them. What if we could help? What are you suggesting? What if we hosted gatherings here, once a month maybe, for people with disabilities and their families? A place where they could share experiences, learn from each other, not feel so alone. You could teach them what you've learned. We could show them that life goes on, just differently." Eleanor felt excitement building in her chest. "That's brilliant, but it's a big commitment. The best things always are," Thomas smiled. "Besides, we have the space now with the new house. And you're always saying you want to do more than just bookkeeping." The first gathering happened 2 months later, on a crisp October afternoon. Eleanor had sent word through her network of clients and through Dr. Morrison. She'd been hoping for maybe 5 or 6 people. 23 showed up. There were people in wheelchairs like Eleanor, people on crutches, people missing limbs, people with conditions that affected their mobility in different ways. There were family members, spouses, parents, children, all looking for guidance and community. Eleanor was overwhelmed at first, but Thomas was there, steady as always. Together, they welcomed everyone into their home and their barn, which they'd set up with tables and chairs. "I'm not an expert," Eleanor began, addressing the group. "I don't have all the answers, but I do know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like your life is over, to feel like a burden. And I know that those feelings are lies, hard to ignore, but lies nonetheless." She shared her story, the accident, the isolation, the cruelty, the gradual acceptance, and finally the joy she'd found with Thomas. She talked about the practical aspects of adapting to disability, but also about the emotional journey of learning to value herself again. Others began to share their stories. A veteran who'd lost his arm in the war and was struggling to find work. A young woman with polio who wanted to go to college, but whose family said it was impossible. An older man with arthritis so severe he could barely hold a pen, worried he was losing his independence. The gathering lasted for hours. People exchanged ideas, offered support, made connections. When everyone finally left, many were in tears. But they were tears of relief and gratitude. "We're doing this again," Eleanor told Thomas that night. "Every month, no matter what." And they did. The monthly gatherings became a fixture in the community. Word spread across counties, then across the state. People traveled hours to attend. The gatherings grew so large that they had to move them to the barn permanently, and then build an addition to accommodate everyone. Eleanor began writing articles for agricultural magazines about accessibility and disability, sharing practical advice for other farming families. She corresponded with doctors and advocates in bigger cities, learning about new developments and sharing what she'd learned from experience. 10 years into their marriage, a reporter from the Omaha World Herald came to do a story on the wheelchair farmer's wife who changed Nebraska. Eleanor hated the title. She was more than Thomas's wife and more than her wheelchair, but she agreed to the interview because it might help others. The reporter, a young woman named Catherine, spent 3 days at the farm. She attended one of the monthly gatherings, interviewed dozens of people, and followed Eleanor through her daily routine. "What I don't understand," Catherine said on the final day, "is how you overcame the bitterness after how this town treated you, after your own mother's cruelty. How did you not become angry and hard?" Eleanor thought carefully before answering. "I did become angry and hard, for a while. I let other people's cruelty convince me I was worthless. But then Thomas came along and showed me something different. He showed me that one person seeing your value can outweigh 100 people's blindness. And once I knew my own worth again, other people's opinions stopped having power over me." She paused, looking out at the fields Thomas was working. The truth is, bitterness would have given them what they wanted, proof that I was broken. By building a good life, by being happy, by helping others, that was the best revenge I could have. I took what they meant to destroy me with and turned it into my greatest strength. The article ran in early 1891 and created a sensation. Suddenly, Eleanor and Thomas were receiving letters from across the country. Some were from people with disabilities, thanking them for giving them hope. Others were from doctors and social reformers, asking for advice on improving accessibility in their own communities. One letter stood out. It was from a lawyer in New York named Samuel Goldstein, who was working on legislation to require public buildings to be accessible to people with disabilities. "Your work in Millbrook has shown what's possible," he wrote. "Would you be willing to testify before the New York State Legislature about the changes you've implemented? Your practical experience combined with the economic success of your farm would be powerful evidence that accessibility is both right and feasible." Eleanor looked at Thomas, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. "New York? Testify before the legislature? Why not?" Thomas grinned. "You've already changed Nebraska. Might as well work on the rest of the country." The trip to New York was daunting, but thrilling. Eleanor had never seen anything like the city. The towering buildings, the crowded streets, the endless energy. She testified before a committee of stern-faced legislators, telling her story and explaining the changes Millbrook had made. "Accessibility isn't charity," she told them. "It's good business and good community sense. When you build a world that works for people with disabilities, you build a world that works better for everyone. Mothers with strollers, elderly people, anyone carrying heavy packages, they all benefit from ramps and wider doorways and thoughtful design." She presented financial data showing that Millbrook's businesses had actually seen increased traffic after becoming accessible. She shared letters from dozens of families whose lives had been transformed by the monthly gatherings. She spoke plainly about the cost of isolation, not just to individuals, but to communities that lost the contributions of talented people simply because of inaccessible buildings. The legislation didn't pass that year, but seeds were planted. More importantly, Eleanor had discovered a new calling. She began traveling to other towns and cities, consulting on accessibility, speaking to civic groups, and helping establish support networks for people with disabilities. Through it all, Thomas was her constant support. He managed the farm while she traveled, met her at train stations, and listened to her excited recounting of each new victory. Their partnership had evolved but remained strong. They were still kneeling beside each other, metaphorically speaking, seeing eye to eye. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Eleanor with a gift. He led her outside to find a beautiful sign mounted at the entrance to their farm. "Wade Accessible Farm and Community Center. I wanted to make it official," he said. "This isn't just our home anymore. It's a place that belongs to everyone who needs it. A place where people learn they're not alone, not broken, not less than. You built that, Eleanor. I'm just the man lucky enough to help." Eleanor was crying again. Happy tears this time. "We built it together. Everything we have, everything we've done. It's because we found each other when we both thought we were lost. The town called you cursed," Thomas said softly, kneeling beside her wheelchair one more time. "But you were my blessing, my salvation. The answer to prayers I didn't know how to pray. And you were mine," Eleanor whispered, kissing him. "You knelt at my feet when everyone else looked away. You saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable." They sat together on the porch as the sun set over their fields, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the distance, they could hear laughter from the barn. Another gathering was happening, more lives being touched, more connections being made. Eleanor thought about the girl she'd been 15 years ago, bitter, isolated, convinced her life was over. She thought about all the pain that had brought her to that place, and all the joy that had come after. She thought about Thomas appearing in her life like an unexpected gift, about Caroline's deathbed reconciliation, about Sarah Miller and the hundreds of others they'd helped. Most of all, she thought about the simple truth that had changed everything. Disability hadn't ended her story. It had just changed the way the story was told. And in the end, it had become a story worth telling. A story of love, conquering judgment, of courage overcoming fear, of two broken people finding wholeness in each other. A story of a farmer who knelt at the feet of the woman the world had called cursed and saw instead a queen. Years later, when Eleanor was in her 70s and Thomas's hair had gone completely white, a young journalist came to interview them for a book about the disability rights movement in America. The journalist wanted to know what Eleanor considered her greatest achievement. Eleanor thought for a long moment, looking at Thomas beside her, at the thriving farm around them, at the legacy they'd built together. "My greatest achievement," she said finally, was refusing to believe the story others told about me. They said I was cursed, that my life was over, that I was a burden. But I wrote a different story, one where a woman in a wheelchair could be loved, could be successful, could change the world in her own small way. And the beautiful thing about stories is that once you tell them, other people can see themselves in them. They can write their own different endings too. She squeezed Thomas's hand, and he squeezed back, their touch still electric after 5 decades together. That's what Thomas gave me. Not the ability to walk, but the ability to see myself as I truly was. Worthy, capable, whole, and that changed everything. The journalist scribbled notes, then asked one final question. What would you say to someone who's facing their own curse right now? Someone who thinks their life is over? Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the people she'd met over the years, all the lives that had been transformed by refusing to accept the limits others imposed. I'd tell them what Thomas showed me, that sometimes the things the world calls curses are actually invitations. Invitations to become stronger than you knew you could be, to find love in unexpected places, to build something new and beautiful from the rubble of what you lost. The curse isn't what happens to you. It's believing that what happens to you defines what you can become. She looked at Thomas again, at the man who had knelt at her feet when she thought no one would ever look at her with love again. And I'd tell them to watch for the person who kneels beside you when everyone else walks away. That person is showing you your true value. That person is offering you not pity, but partnership. And if you're brave enough to accept it, that person just might help you write the most beautiful chapter of your life. The journalist left with her story, but Eleanor and Thomas stayed on their porch as the sun set one more time over their fields. The barn doors were open for that evening's gathering, golden light spilling out into the growing darkness. Voices and laughter drifted across the farm. More people finding community, finding hope, finding themselves. Not bad for a cursed bride and a disgraced banker's son, Thomas said with a smile. Not bad at all, Eleanor agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. Not bad at all. And in that moment, surrounded by the life they'd built from broken pieces, they both knew the truth. There had been no curse. There had only been 2 people brave enough to see past what the world told them was impossible and build something real instead. Something that would outlast them both, rippling forward through time in the lives they'd touched and the minds they'd changed. The woman they called cursed had become a blessing. The farmer who knelt had lifted them both higher than they'd ever dreamed. And their story, their true story, had just begun.